Great. Okay, so good evening. Nice to see all of you here tonight. We're going to be doing something, I hope which will be a little bit fun for tonight's class. We're going to be studying the Haggadah, but instead of just kind of random insights into it, I'm going to be focusing on specific insights that have to do with the subject of isolation, which I thought would be perhaps insightful for this year's Haggadah, since we're all going to be celebrating Pesach in isolation, whether limited to your immediate family who are living with you, or whether literally on your own. And so what we'll actually find is that I think there's actually quite a lot in the Haggadah that speaks to this reality, to this situation, and perhaps can allow us to actually connect with the Haggadah this year, almost in more of a way than maybe we've been able to recently. We often have that experience of, we've been through this, we know what this is, and we are going through the motions. But there's really that idea that we find in Haggadah that, we're supposed to do it every single year. Afilu chachamim, even the wise ones who presumably know everything, that you can't help it that every year you see something new. You put a bit of yourself into the experience of the Haggadah, and you see new insights. And I think that's certainly the case this year, that we certainly are seeing new ideas in the Haggadah as a result of the way that our lives have changed this year. So with that, we're going to begin. We have about a half hour, and I'm just going to kind of go through different ideas. If people have questions, please feel free to ask. If you're not in the midst of asking a question, though, please just leave your Zoom on mute. That way we don't pick up the background sound from you. If anyone is having difficulty doing that, please let me know, and I can mute you for you. Great. All right. Well, it sounds quiet now, so it seems like everyone's got a hold of it.
Not yet, Rabbi, not yet.
Would you like me to mute you?
Please, me and everybody.
All right. So let's see. There is a way to mute all participants. I'm trying to see how I can do that. Okay. I'm not sure how to do that. I know there is a way for me to mute everyone in one fell swoop, but I'm not sure how to do that. So in any case, so let's carry on. It sounds quiet. Okay, so I'm going to be doing a share screen with you so that we can take a look at the Haggadah together. Let me just find that. Okay, I think this is it. Brilliant. Okay, great. Okay, good. So here we have the Haggadah. So we can be looking at it together. It's here both in Hebrew and in English. So the first thing is, of course, we always start the Haggadah with Kiddush. And so it's a bit of a strange experience this year. Obviously, if you're with other people, you're going to recite these prayers out loud together. The question is if you're on your own, are you supposed to just say it out loud to a quiet room? So there's actually a bit of a discussion of that in general regards to tefillah, regards to prayer, whether a person should pray out loud. And of course, in synagogue, we do recite many of the prayers out loud. There is, though, a discussion that in general, if a person is praying on their own, that it may be considered to be a lack of humility to pray out loud, almost assuming that God can't hear you if you don't pray out loud, meaning, why do you need to say things out loud? Obviously God can hear you even if you're saying something quietly. But obviously there's this added component where when you say things out loud, it helps you to get into the moment. You get to enjoy certainly the songs and so on. So I would definitely encourage everyone to say bits of it out loud, particularly things that have melodies in them, so that you can enjoy the Haggadah and kind of get into the experience by actively engaging in it, and not just reading it with your eyes. And of course, doing it on your own, that might be challenging for some people. So the Haggadah can be read in English as well. And I certainly would encourage you to take a look at the English, to understand what you're saying, so that again it can be meaningful. Because ultimately, that is the purpose of the Haggadah, that we're supposed to learn something from it, and not just to kind of read it by rote, but actually to learn from it. And when you're at a table full of people and there's lots of discussion, that often kind of comes about. But when you're doing it on your own with just 2 or 3 people, then that's going to be a bit more challenging. So definitely spend some time, reflecting on what it is that you're reading. Perhaps there'll be a little bit less discussion going on. And so it will still go probably quicker than usual. And so you'll have a little bit of the extra time to actually look at what you're reading as you read it. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. I want to move on, because the next step of the Haggadah is, of course, the washing of the hands and the karpas. And the idea with having the karpas, having this vegetable at the very beginning of your meal, is part of this idea that we're supposed to see ourselves as kings on the night of Pesach. And in ancient times, particularly in Roman times, but you can even think of today, right? There always was that appetizer, that kind of like crudité that you would have at the beginning of your meal. And so that was incorporated into the Haggadah as well. And so there is this element that we should feel regal, we should feel royal on Pesach, which again is difficult when you're on your own, or there's just the 2 of you. It's not like you have servants to come and serve you on these occasions. And so a person should still try their best to create that environment, setting your table beautifully, making it special, and doing things to kind of feel a bit pampered in some way during it, whether that's the dipping of the vegetable in the salt water, or just kind of and even though your Haggadah in a sense might be smaller, don't make it less beautiful. Still try to invest in it to make it feel like you're still participating in what really is one of the most important Jewish rituals. And so again, that has to do with using your nice china, if that's what you use, or trying to embellish it in some regard. Set up your table nicely, even if you're setting just for one, but you can still set it nicely for yourself, to make it as lovely as possible. Okay, I'm just going to kind of keep going as we go, just kind of throwing out ideas as we go. The next step of the Haggadah is, of course, the yachatz, where we break the middle of matzah. And the idea of that is that the matzah is supposed to represent poverty. And so we break it because poor people don't have a whole piece of matzah. But there's an added element in that as well, right? This idea, and we'll look at that as we go on, right? Is that idea that a person should try to get in touch with the story of the Exodus, right? And it has to do with feeling, that the poverty of slavery, and then ultimately, obviously, the success of freedom. And that's often something which can be challenging for us to do in our modern lives. And so we break the matzah to kind of help us maybe get into that mindset a little bit. Obviously, this year, it's going to be a bit easier to maybe get into that mindset of that experience of suffering. And so I think when we break the matzah this year, really going to feel like how kind of like broken our lives are. And I think that's like really powerful. It can be a really powerful message for us as we break it, because we won't only be breaking it thinking about, oh yes, there's other poor people in the world, but we're really going to be experiencing ourselves, an element of deprivation for this year's Pesach. And so I think when you break that matzah, really have in mind how things are broken this year in that respect. Okay, so let's move on. This is kind of the main part of the Haggadah, that of Magid, where you're supposed to tell the story of the Exodus. This is really kind of one of the key mitzvot of the night, is the mitzvah to tell the story. And so we tell the story beginning with this opening line. And this opening phrase is the halachma anya over here. And we say, this is the bread of affliction. And there's this sentence that we say in here, which is often peculiar, but it'll be particularly striking this year. Because we say anyone who is famished. Sorry, let me just remove that. We say anyone who is famished should come and eat. And so we essentially are starting our Haggadah with an invitation, inviting people to our table. If you were thinking of inviting someone to your table, don't do it, right? Meaning that's actually something really dangerous to do this year, right? People should definitely not be joining with other people for their Haggadot, for their Seder. Even if you know other people in isolation, you should all be staying separate, staying in your own homes. And yet, at the very beginning of the Haggadah, we're actually inviting people to come in. I mean, it feels so peculiar, such a mismatch for this year's Haggadah. And in general, usually it feels a bit strange because you've already sat down, it's 8:30 at night, anyone who's coming is already there, and yet you're starting with this invitation to who? The people that are already at your table. So it's always a bit of a strange line. And some of the commentaries explain that you're not perhaps in this moment actually inviting someone to your table, but what you're basically saying is that, that experience of what it means to be free is that you are able to invite people to your table. And I think that's particularly poignant this year, right? Because on some level we are limited from that. And perhaps that's something that we're kind of almost praying for this year, right? That we should be able to invite people to our table. And if we can't invite them this year, we look forward to next year when we will be able to invite others to our table. And I think that's something we're going to really relish, when this is all over, is that simple joy of being able to share a meal with friends and family, to strangers, people who are in need. And I think particularly perhaps through this year to become more sensitive to that, about there are people that are alone. And next year, when you can invite people, do invite people. Think about people in your community who are maybe alone on Pesach, who don't have someone else to be with them, and that's considered to be one of the greatest expressions of freedom, of wealth, is the ability to invite other people to your home. And we should make sure in the future that we actually exercise that. That is the greatest thing we can do, is to share the blessings that we have with other people and to take care of them. And I think we can appreciate this year that, there's one thing about being poor, but this other kind of poverty of loneliness as well, and the ability to invite someone to your home, to share a meal with someone, to give someone a call, right, can go such a long way to helping people, to caring for people that otherwise might be lonely. So I think that's a really powerful line in this year's Haggadah. Okay. So let's move on, because here there's a great part. So this is the 4 questions, the Manishtana, where we ask questions. Why is tonight different than all other nights? And of course, traditionally, the child asks the parent this particular question. And so the question is, what do you do when you don't have a child to ask the parent the question, or in fact, where you may not have anyone to ask the question if you're doing it in isolation, if you're doing it alone. So I want to share with you, because this is actually discussed in the Talmud. So this is a very old question, and for the first time in my life, it actually is relevant. So anyone who ever says, the Talmudic discussions are obscure and far-fetched and have no application, see, coronavirus, they do. So I'm going to show you, I've now switched over to the tractate of Pesachim, which is the tractate of Passover. And we're going to read from the Mishnah what it says. And we'll read the Mishnah and then the commentary of the Talmud. And so the Mishnah says, the attendants, right? So again, there were servants serving you, right? The idea of being free and people serving you. So the attendants poured the second cup for the leader of the Seder. And here the son asks his father the questions about the differences between the Passover night and a regular night. And then it says, and if the son does not have intelligence to ask questions on his own, his father teaches him the questions. So here you already have a little bit of an inkling in the Mishnah, where it says that if a child can't ask, then the father can simply teach the questions. So you already have this idea that it doesn't necessarily have to be completely a question answer, but it can be an opportunity to study. And the Talmud actually takes this a bit further and has it with this language over here where I'm pointing to. So the Gemara says, the sages taught, this is now the Talmud, if his son is wise and knows how to inquire, his son asks him. If he is not wise, then his wife asks him, meaning someone should ask the person who's leading the Haggadah. And even if his son is not capable of asking, or if he has no wife, right? So again, essentially describing a situation where a person is alone, he asks himself. He asks himself. And even if two Torah scholars who know the halachot of Passover are sitting together, right? So even if you have two people who know it all, there's no point asking a question. They know it all. They both know it. And there is no one else present to pose the questions. They ask each other. And so you have this element of the Haggadah, which is ideally meant to be framed in a question and answer style, right? And that's based on the language of the Torah, that the Torah says over and over again, if your son should ask you, what is this? You shall say to him that God took us out with an outstretched hand, right? There's all these languages in the Torah where it talks about children and parents, children asking questions and the parents answering them. That's in the Torah itself. And so that notion is built into the Haggadah itself, where it's meant to be question and answer. And what it's essentially saying is that you may have times where someone is not capable of asking a question, or you may literally not have anyone there who can ask the question. And what the Talmud is saying, what the Mishnah is saying, is ask anyway. Ask it to yourself, articulate it, use it as an opportunity for study, as a point for reflection, and that a person can engage in that even on their own. And while that might feel a bit strange, we still apply that approach to it, where we kind of reflect and think about things on their own. And if a person has ever kind of studied in yeshiva or seen students study yeshiva, oftentimes often you study with chavruta, with a study partner, but sometimes, particularly if you're reviewing, you study it on your own, and you sit there and you go through the questions and you essentially say it out loud. You say, Rava says, why did this? Oh, that because the answer is this. Why did he say that? And you actually kind of think it all out loud, as you kind of reflect and think about what it is that you're doing. And so there is that possibility still of kind of thinking out loud, as it were, with yourself, and being able to still ask questions and answers to yourself anyway. And that's the structure, the style of rabbinic texts like the Haggadah, and that we should do that. We can do that even if we're doing it on our own. But I think it will certainly help us to appreciate when we can actually do it with another person as well. But again, that idea that it's not supposed to, as much as possible, to not make it just this empty thing we're doing, but there's actually a benefit to kind of doing it in this way, in the way that it helps us to really kind of sink our teeth into it, to really think about what it is that we're asking. Okay, so here, the Haggadah, after we've asked the question of the Manishtana, we begin to provide the answers, right? Of course, the answer is, why is tonight different than from all other nights? Is Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim vayotzienu Hashem Elokeinu misham biyad chazaka, right? That we were slaves to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt, and the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, right? That's the answer. Why do we do these things? Because we were slaves and we were free. And the Mishnah that we were looking at before says that this is the way that the Haggadah is meant to be structured, because here it says, and I'm quoting, it says, and according to the intelligence and the ability of his son, his father teaches him about the Exodus. When teaching his son about the Exodus, he begins with the Jewish people's disgrace and concludes with their glory, right? And the Talmud will say, what does that mean with our disgrace and our glory? And they say, oh, that means either that we were slaves and then we were free, or that once upon a time we were idolaters and now we're monotheists, right? And so immediately after we've asked a question, we answer, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and now God has taken us out and we are free, right? And so that, again, once again, becomes one of the core ideas of the Haggadah, is that transition, is that experience of servitude and freedom. And again, I think often it's really hard to kind of put ourselves into that, to kind of think about that. But this year, it's actually a bit easier. It's a bit easier to kind of have that feeling, well, we aren't slaves. We are kind of forced to remain in our homes. We can't go out. We can't go enjoy the world, right? So we have a bit of that slave experience where we are all limited, right? And we don't have freedom. We can't just do what we want when we want to do it. We're actually confined, whether completely or to some extent, in our homes. And I think that allows us to maybe really think about this year. What does it mean to be a slave? Or what does it mean to have not had free will, to not have been able to determine how we would spend our time, the kinds of professions we would do, how we'd like to enjoy, our free time and so on. And so I think this year we actually really can think about the experience of slavery in a way that maybe was harder to do in the past, but I think this year we can actually do so. We can do so a bit more. And so let's carry on then with the Haggadah, because the Haggadah then continues with the story of the rabbis. And here the story, it describes, it says, it had happened once, the Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon were reclining in Bnei Brak and were telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt the whole night. And so we see that these rabbis were grouped together. Maybe I'll talk about this more in the next class we do next week. But it could be that they were in actually isolation, as it were. It was the times of persecution. And so it's possible they are actually isolated, perhaps even hiding in their home in Bnei Brak. And so even perhaps one of the prominent stories in the Haggadah is actually describing a case of isolation as well, where literally these rabbis were isolating from the rest of the community. And it may have been as a result of the Hadrianic persecutions, or it's unclear exactly, or perhaps just after the fall of Jerusalem, that they were forced to seclude, to hide from the Roman authorities. Okay, so let's continue on now, moving right along. So you move on to the 4 sons, right? The wise, the wicked, the one who does not know how to ask, and the simple son. And the famous question of the Rasha is, here I'll show you, right? What does this evil son say, right? What is this worship to you? To you and not to him. And since he excluded himself from the collective, he denied a principle of the Jewish faith, right? So the Rasha, the thing that's considered wicked about the Rasha is the fact that he is poresh minat tzibor, that he is separating himself from the rest of the community, right? And for Jews, that's considered to be a terrible sin, to kind of say, oh, those Jews and me over here. We're supposed to feel we're part of collective, we're all part of the Jewish people, even though we may be different from each other, but we're part of one Jewish nation, and that danger of kind of separating ourselves from each other. But of course, this year, we are separating ourselves from one another. And so I think particularly this year, it's important to appreciate the fact of, imagining how amazing that is, that all these Jews are going to be in separate places. We're all going to be doing the same thing. And even if we're on our own, even if it's just a couple of us, and actually how powerful that is, that how many more homes this year are actually going to be celebrating Pesach. People won't be in hotels. People won't, really everyone in their homes are going to be celebrating Pesach this year. And that's actually, we're not separating ourselves. We're actually joining with each other. There's like this great kind of like sense of nationhood that we're actually going to be doing this year. And why it's so important that even if it's hard to do it on your own, do it on your own. Participate, be part of the Jewish people this year, even if you have to, do it on your own in that respect. And that way we are really doing the antidote to the Rasha. We're not separating ourselves, but we're actually joining together, if not physically together, spiritually. We're joining together as well. moving on, there is the Haggadah begins by talking a little bit that once upon a time were idolaters, and it talks here about Avraham, about Abraham, right? That Abraham was chosen by God, right? And that Abraham was told to go travel throughout the land, right, to acquire the land of Canaan. And Avraham, right, is known as Av Hamon Goyim, the father of the nations. And when we think of Avraham, we think of someone on his own, right? We say that he was called the Ivri because he stood on one side and the rest of the world stood on the other side, right? He was the first monotheist, and he had that difficult experience of really being lonely, being alone in his experience. But ultimately, he becomes the father of the Jewish people and the father of monotheism. You think of, how many billions of people in the world are monotheists now that descend ultimately from the teachings of Avraham, and kind of this power that we can actually have being alone, that actually we can still do great things, that we can, that being alone is an experience of the Jewish people, unfortunately, in our history, but even of our forefather Abraham as well. And perhaps we can get a bit of strength from knowing that even if we're on our own, we're not the first to be on our own. Even Avraham was on his own, and look at how he came out of it, and look at the great things that he accomplished. Presumably he was with his wife as well, so that's good. But that notion of feeling that on our own is something which we can connect with from our story of our people, and when perhaps feeling a bit down this year, that we're on our own, to gain strength, that we're actually maybe following in the footsteps of Avraham. That idea of being an Ivri, right, being a Hebrew, right, comes from that language of being other or being separate from, and that is our namesake, right? That willingness that even if sometimes we're on our own, we still stand our ground, we still persevere, we still carry on with our beliefs and with our values. And so when we do that this year, we are all being Avrahams. We are all being Avraham in that respect. Continuing on in the Haggadah, we talk about the Exodus from Egypt, and here there's a great notion that you find over here as well, where we say that God took us out from Egypt. Just trying to find that language. Yeah. Right, where here we say that God, it says, and the Lord took us out from Egypt. And it says, not through an angel, not through a seraph, not through a messenger, but directly by the Holy One, blessed be he. And many people point out that Moshe's name does not appear in the Haggadah. Perhaps in one place it appears, but not as a central point. And this idea that our relationship to God is not between any intermediaries, right? This is a core belief in Judaism, right? We don't go to a religious figure to pray on our behalf, right? We go directly to God, right? We have this relationship with God. And again, oftentimes I think in our religious life, we rely on other people, whether it's other family members or the rabbi or, whatever the case may be. But ultimately, each of us is supposed to have our own individual relationship with being Jewish and with God, and have our own sense of ownership over our ability to follow the Torah. And perhaps that's something to think about when reading this verse in the Haggadah this year, right? Is that idea that at the end of the day, God took us out without any intermediaries. God took each of us out individually, and that idea that each of us has perhaps as an opportunity this year to really connect with God, and to connect with our Judaism and connect with our identity in a really direct way, where we take personal ownership over it without any messengers, without any intermediaries, right? We are going to do it on our own this year. And that's actually, I think, something to be really empowering as we go through this Pesach and really everything that we are going through. Okay. Moving on, after the verses in the Haggadah, you get to the 10 plagues. We're going to kind of skip through this. Next class, I'll go into the plagues a bit more. And here we get to the Taino. Everyone can sing that on their own. And here we get to Rabbi Gamliel and the three things. And what he says, he should point out the three things of Pesach, matzah, and maror. That's considered to be essential for the Haggadah. And one of the things we point out, right, is the Pesach, the Paschal offering, right? So there's the bone on the plate where it's supposed to symbolize the Paschal offering. And of course, it represents that God passed over the homes, right? And I think this is one of the most meaningful parts of this year's Pesach, is that what does it say? Well, how did it work in Egypt? Is that everyone went into their own homes, right? So, and it was in their homes that they were protected, that God hovered over them, and the angel of death, in a sense, passed over their homes while God protected them. And it's this amazing idea that Passover, more than any other Jewish holiday, is actually a home holiday, right? The Haggadah is meant to be observed ideally in a person's home. And this year, as I mentioned before, so many people are going to have the opportunity to celebrate that, to enjoy that, because we are all celebrating in our home. And that's the way it was, back in Egypt. We were all in our homes, and in our homes, we were protected from the plague, that passed around us. And we've all huddled in our homes this year to be protected from the plague that is around us. And so we've, in a sense, maybe returned to that original Pesach, being in our homes, and so that we should gain kind of strength, that we are kind of really observing Pesach this year in the way that our ancestors did as well. And I think that's something really to be perhaps make your Pesach meaningful for you this year. Okay. After we talk about the Pesach matzah and maror, we then have this phrase here, which again I think is something I've referenced already, where we say b'chol dor v'ador chayav adam lerot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. That in each and every generation, a person is obligated to see himself as if he left Egypt, right? So that we are supposed to kind of really get in touch with the experience. And it's why we have all these rituals, all these things we eat, and these different symbols to help us connect with the story, the Exodus, that sense of that times were dire, we called out to God, and God rescued us, and then we were free, and that experience of salvation. And I think this year we can really do that. We can really kind of get into that moment, because we're kind of experiencing it in our own lives right now. So we can really connect with the historic experience of the Jewish people as well. And I think that will be something perhaps really meaningful about this year's Pesach in isolation, that we really are going to be able to connect with that idea of trying to put ourselves in that place, to see ourselves as if we went out from Egypt, because we are all experiencing a degree of slavery, as it were, this year, and looking forward to when we will be free. And finally, and this is what I want to conclude with, we say a little bit of the Hallel and the Haggadah, and then we say the blessing over the wine. And here in the blessing, it's a incredibly hopeful blessing that we recite. And I'm just going to read part of it to you. We say, blessed are you, right? We raise our cup and we say, blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who redeemed us and redeemed our ancestors from Egypt and brought us on the night to eat matzah and maror. So too, Lord our God and God of our ancestors, bring us to other appointed times and holidays that will come to greet us in peace, joyful in the building of your city, and happy in your worship. Right? And so we end with this like really positive, hopeful message that we pray that, just as we've recounted the Exodus from Egypt, that we should all merit to have this freedom, the freedom to return obviously to Jerusalem with the temple, right? It's a kind of that messianic element, but also I think we can really experience it about like, we're looking forward to that joy. I mean, think how joyful it's gonna be when we can finally all leave and get about our lives and go about and come to synagogue and worship together and have the seder with other people, and how great that's going to be to go travel to Jerusalem and pray at the wall. I mean, how great that's going to feel for us after all of this. And so I really love the Haggadah. While we talk about the slavery, really does conclude with this hopeful message of anticipation, of looking forward to the blessings that will come. So I really just want to conclude by giving everyone that blessing that this is certainly going to be a strange year, but in some ways perhaps can be particularly meaningful. It's something that we'll be able to carry with us throughout our lives. Please God, everyone should be healthy and well, and that hopefully we can transform what will be a challenging seder, a challenging Passover, hopefully into one that will be maybe even more meaningful than others have been in general in the past, And there are so many elements of the Haggadah that I think really speak to this experience of being in isolation, being in our homes, being on our own. And I think this year will perhaps allow us to connect with those messages in the Haggadah in a way that maybe we haven't been able in the past. And so this will give us some more opportunity as we go forward. We have about 2 minutes left before our time runs out. If anyone has any quick comments or questions, please ask them now. Next week, we'll have some additional classes. So I look forward to sharing those with you as well. We'll have the Haggadah class next Tuesday night. We're going to talk about plagues. And that, of course, has a lot of meaning this year as well. Does anyone have any final thoughts? Great. It's been great seeing all of you who tuned in with your videos, and just nice being with all of you tonight to study. And I wish everyone continued health, and look forward to speaking to all of you soon. Have a good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Me or them?
Bye.